Chapter 16. Ready? Lachlan's voice was calm, but his golden eyes burned with intensity. Her heart pounded, not from fear, but from something deeper. Ready? Ready? Lachlan's voice was calm, but his golden eyes burned with intensity. It was really ancient that stirred within her, ready from intensity. Ready. Alyssa swallowed hard, nodding. Let's do this. Lachlan took a blade from the table and sliced his palm, blood pooling in his hand. Alyssa followed, wincing as the blade pricked her skin. Their hands met, palm to palm, and the moment their blood mingled, Alyssa felt a surge of warmth spreading through her veins like liquid fire. She gasped softly. The cabin around her seemed to shift, the walls blurring at the edges, as if the land itself was waking up. Lachlan's grip tightened around her hand. That's the bond. Elisa's breathing slowed as the sensation settled, leaving her stronger, steadier. I can feel it. Like I'm connected to everything. You are, Lachlan said softly. The land, the cabin, me. We're tied together now. It'll protect you, and you'll protect it. Alyssa nodded, the weight of responsibility sinking in. For the first time, she wasn't scared. They rose to their feet, still holding hands as if breaking the connection might shatter the fragile magic between them. Lachlan flexed his hand, and she could already see the change in him. His wounds, ones that should have taken days to heal, were fading. His stance was stronger, his muscles taut with newfound energy. This bond. It's making you stronger, Alyssa whispered. Lachlan met her gaze, the gold in his eyes burning brighter than ever. It's not just me. You feel it too, don't you? Alyssa paused, listening to the faint hum beneath her skin. Her senses were sharper, the pulse of the land more vivid than ever before. I do, she admitted. It's like I know everything happening around us. Every branch, every shift in the wind. That's the land responding to you. It recognizes you as part of it now. Alyssa stepped onto the porch, the snow crunching softly beneath her boots. She scanned the tree line, no longer seeing it as just a barrier between them and Kyle. It was a weapon. This land is ours, she said firmly. Lachlan stood beside her, his eyes fixed on the dark forest ahead. And we'll defend it. The rest of the day was spent fortifying the cabin. Corbin helped lay traps while Alyssa carved more protective symbols along the perimeter, her hand guided by something instinctual, as if the land itself whispered the designs into her ear. Lachlan circled the clearing, his movements sharper and faster than before. His senses were heightened, and Alyssa noticed the subtle way he reacted to every sound, every flicker of movement in the trees. Feel like a superhero yet? She teased as he leapt over a fallen log with ease. Lachlan smirked. I could get used to this. Corbin glanced up from setting a snare. Not to kill the mood, but let's not forget the part where Kale's pack tries to rip us apart. Alyssa's grin faded, but she squared her shoulders. Let them come. We're ready. Corbin snorted. I admire the confidence. Let's just hope it doesn't get us killed. By nightfall, the preparations were finished. The traps were set, the land fortified, and the cabin felt more like a fortress than a home. Alyssa stood by the window, staring out into the dark expanse of the forest. Lachlan stood behind her, his hands resting lightly on her shoulders. You should rest, he murmured. I can't, she admitted. He's coming. I can feel it. Lachlan's gaze shifted to the forest, his eyes narrowing. You're not wrong. The faint sound of a wolf's howl pierced the night air, long and low. Alyssa shivered. That's him, isn't it? Lachlan nodded grimly. Yeah, Kale's here. The howl was followed by another, then another. In the distance, shadows shifted between the trees. Alyssa's pulse quickened, but she didn't flinch. The bond coursing through her reminded her she wasn't alone. She met Lachlan's gaze, her expression hardening. This time, she said, gripping his hand, we end it. The soft crunch of boots echoed through the clearing as Corbin returned, flanked by 3 figures Alyssa didn't recognize. Their sharp eyes flicked toward her and Lachlan as they approached, the tension in the air heavy enough to cut with a knife. Well, I brought reinforcements, Corbin said, jerking a thumb over his shoulder. Try not to scare them off, Alyssa. Alyssa smirked. I'll behave. Can't make any promises about Lachlan, though. Lachlan raised an eyebrow, but said nothing, his gaze focused on the newcomers. The tallest of the 3 stepped forward, a woman with dark braided hair and an air of quiet authority. Her amber eyes flicked between Alyssa and Lachlan. This is Amara, Corbin said, gesturing toward her. She leads the group that split from Kale's pack last year. I figured she wouldn't mind returning the favor. Amara crossed her arms. Corbin's lucky I owe him. Otherwise I wouldn't be out here freezing my tail off for you two. Lachlan stepped forward, offering a nod of respect. I appreciate it, Amara. We need all the help we can get. Her gaze softened slightly. I'm not here for you, Lachlan. I'm here because Kale's getting too bold. If we don't stop him now, none of us will be safe. Alyssa watched their interaction closely. Amara's presence carried weight. This wasn't just a group of outcasts. They were fighters. The other 2 shifters stood quietly behind her, one sharpening a blade while the other scanned the tree line, already anticipating the fight ahead. Alyssa, she asked. Alyssa stepped closer. Thank you for coming, she said, making eye contact with Amara. This is my land, too, and I'm not letting Kale take it without a fight. Amara studied her for a long moment before nodding approvingly. I like her. Corbin snorted. You say that now. Give it a day. Alyssa shot him a glare. By midday, the group had spread out across the clearing, setting traps and reinforcing defenses. The snow around the cabin was crisscrossed with barriers, hidden pits, spiked branches, and lines of salt that glimmered faintly under the pale sun. Alyssa crouched beside one of the snares, tightening the wire while Lachlan stood nearby, keeping watch. You sure about all this? Lachlan asked quietly, his eyes flicking toward Corbin and Amara's group. Alyssa didn't look up. They're here, aren't they? That's enough for me. Lachlan hesitated. I don't want you thinking this is all on you. She paused, turning to face him. Lachlan, I chose this. I could have walked away, but I didn't. I'm not running, and I'm not letting Kale win. His gaze softened, and for a moment, the weight between them lifted. You've changed, Lachlan said, brushing his fingers against her hand. Alyssa smirked. I blame you. He chuckled, stepping closer. I'll take that as a compliment. Alyssa's heart thudded as their fingers intertwined. The bond between them felt stronger, unspoken, but undeniable. This wasn't just about defending land anymore. It was about protecting each other. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the final preparations were made. The group gathered near the cabin, tension thick in the cold air. Alyssa could feel it, the quiet before the storm. Lachlan's allies stood in a loose circle, murmuring quietly, while Corbin tested his crossbow one last time. Alyssa watched them, exhaling slowly. This is it, she whispered. Lachlan nodded, his golden eyes glowing faintly in the fading light. We stand together. A soft growl rumbled in the distance. Alyssa stiffened, scanning the tree line. Then she saw them. Glowing eyes, dozens of them, watching from the shadows just beyond the clearing. Kale's pack had arrived. Alyssa gripped Lachlan's hand tighter, her pulse steady despite the fear curling in her chest. "We're ready," she said. Lachlan's gaze burned with resolve. "Let them come."
Chapter 17. When the Wolves Come. The first snarl shattered the silence. Elisa's pulse quickened as shadows darted between the trees, creeping closer with every passing second. From her perch on the cabin's balcony, she could see the faint glow of eyes watching from the tree line. Kale's pack, waiting for the signal to strike. Lachlan stood at the base of the cabin steps, his golden eyes blazing in the darkness. Corbin crouched beside him, crossbow locked and ready, while Amara and her shifters spread out along the clearing's edge, forming a defensive line. Alyssa gripped the rifle tightly, her breath coming in steady puffs of white against the cold air. "Stay calm," Lachlan called up to her without turning around. "You know what to do." "I'm calm," she replied, lining up her shot. "You just make sure they don't climb the porch," Lachlan smirked. "No promises." The faint snap of a branch echoed through the woods. Then Kale's howl split the night air. The pack erupted from the trees like a flood of fur and teeth. Alyssa's finger tightened on the trigger. The first wolf hit the outer perimeter, springing the trap Alyssa had set earlier that day. A sharp snap followed as the wolf tumbled into a pit concealed beneath the snow, yelping in surprise. Two more darted around the trap, only to be caught by another hidden snare that yanked them off their feet and into the trees. "Nice," Corbin muttered, taking aim and firing a bolt into the shoulder of a wolf who had narrowly avoided the traps, and Alyssa exhaled, shifting her aim to another wolf rushing toward Lachlan. She fired, the crack of the rifle cutting through the night. The shot grazed its flank, causing it to stumble and fall. Lachlan lunged forward, shifting mid-stride. His massive wolf form collided with Kale's advancing forces, teeth flashing and claws slicing through fur. Corbin followed, darting into the fray while Amara's pack attacked from the sides, catching Kale's wolves between them. Alyssa stayed on the balcony, firing whenever she saw an opening. She wasn't just picking them off. She was protecting Lachlan. For the first time, she felt like she wasn't just surviving, she was fighting back. It was the worst night of her life, she told Nettie. One wolf attempted to scale the porch, but Alyssa caught its movement out of the corner of her eye. "Oh no, you don't," she growled, swinging the rifle around and firing at point-blank range. The wolf yelped and dropped back to the ground. "Not bad," Amara called from below, dodging a snapping wolf mid-shift. "She's better with that thing than I thought." Alyssa grinned, loading another round. "I'm full of surprises." The battle raged on, but with each passing minute, Kale's forces thinned. Lachlan, empowered by the bond, fought with ferocity unlike anything Alyssa had ever seen. Every swipe of his claws sent wolves sprawling, and even those who managed to land blows on him were quickly overwhelmed. It felt like they were winning. For a brief moment, hope swelled in Elisa's chest. But then, through the thinning lines of wolves, Kale emerged. He walked calmly through the chaos, hands tucked casually into the pockets of his coat. His sharp gaze flickered toward Alyssa, and a faint smirk tugged at his lips. Her finger hesitated on the trigger. Even as his pack faltered, Kale didn't flinch. He wasn't panicked. He wasn't angry. He was waiting. Lachlan shifted back to human form, breathing heavily as he wiped blood from his face. "Cale," he growled, stepping toward his brother. Cale's smirk grew. "That was fun," he said lightly, eyes glowing in the firelight. "But you didn't think it would end here, did you?" Lachlan's muscles tensed. "I'm not letting you get any closer." Cale held up his hands as if in surrender. "Oh, I know. This was just the warm-up." Alyssa's grip tightened on the rifle, but Cale turned without another word, vanishing into the tree line as his surviving wolves retreated behind him. The clearing fell silent, save for the faint crackle of burning wood from the traps. Alyssa lowered the rifle, her heart still pounding. "He's testing us," Corbin said, kicking snow over one of the smoldering pits. "Seeing how far we'll go." Lachlan wiped the back of his neck, watching the tree line with narrowed eyes. "Next time, he won't hold back." Alyssa descended from the porch, standing beside him. "Then neither will we." Lachlan met her gaze, his hand brushing against hers briefly. "No," he said softly, "we won't." But the snow had barely settled from the first fight when the second wave came. Alyssa stood on the porch, wiping the sweat from her brow despite the cold biting at her skin. The clearing was littered with fallen wolves, Cale's forces retreating deeper into the woods. But the way Cale had smirked as he left, it didn't sit right. Lachlan paced near the tree line, his golden eyes fixed on the shadows beyond. The bond between them buzzed with unease, and Alyssa could feel it vibrating under her skin like an electric current. "He's not done," Lachlan muttered. Corbin emerged from behind the cabin, reloading his crossbow. "That was too easy," he added grimly. "Cale's always been the type to save the worst for last." Alyssa's grip tightened around the rifle. "Let him come, we're ready." But even as the words left her mouth, the air grew colder. A silence hung over the forest, thick and suffocating. Then the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunched over the snow. "I hope you didn't think we were done," Cale said smoothly. Lachlan stepped forward, shifting before Alyssa's eyes. His massive black wolf form lowered into a crouch, ready to spring at the first sign of attack. "Get ready," Corbin muttered, raising his weapon. Alyssa took aim, her heart pounding in rhythm with the tension humming through the clearing. Cale's gaze drifted to Lachlan, and for the first time, his eyes darkened. Cold and predatory. "You should have taken my offer, brother," Cale said quietly. And then, without warning, he shifted. The transformation wasn't like Lachlan's. It was bigger, faster. Cale's body contorted and grew, his fur darker than the shadows that surrounded him. His size dwarfed the other wolves. Twice as large, muscles rippling beneath his coat like coiled steel. Alyssa's breath caught. "He's huge," Corbin hissed. "No kidding," Alyssa muttered, gripping the rifle tighter. Cale let out a low, rumbling growl that echoed across the clearing. The wolves at his back snapped to attention, circling around him like soldiers awaiting a command. "Stay behind me," Lachlan growled in Alyssa's mind, his voice steady but laced with tension. Cale didn't give them time to prepare. With a snarl, he launched himself at Lachlan, slamming into him with the force of a freight train. Lachlan skidded back, claws digging into the snow as he fought to hold his ground. They clashed, teeth bared, snapping and clawing in a blur of black and silver fur. Alyssa aimed, waiting for a clear shot, but the two wolves moved too fast. Come on," she whispered, willing Lachlan to break free. Cale's jaws clamped down on Lachlan's shoulder, wrenching him sideways and throwing him to the ground with a heavy thud. "Lachlan!" Alyssa shouted, panic flaring in her chest. She didn't hesitate. Lifting the rifle, she fired. The shot rang out, striking Cale in the side. He growled, stumbling briefly. But when he turned his gaze toward Alyssa, he didn't look angry. He looked amused. Cale shifted slightly, shaking off the wound like it was nothing more than a scratch. "Well," he said, his voice deep and distorted even in his wolf form, "you've got some fight in you after all." Alyssa swallowed hard, but she didn't lower the rifle. Before she could fire again, Cale lifted his head and let out a long, piercing howl. The woods answered. Wolves, dozens of them, emerged from the shadows, their eyes glowing like fireflies in the dark. Alyssa's stomach dropped. "There's more," Corbin muttered, stepping beside her with his crossbow raised. "I thought we took out half his pack already." Lachlan staggered to his feet, panting heavily as blood dripped from his side. "Alyssa, get inside." "I'm not leaving you," she shot back, taking aim at the nearest wolf. Lachlan growled, swiping at Cale to keep him at bay. But Cale didn't pursue him. Not yet. He was watching Alyssa. "This is just the beginning," Cale called, his grin stretching wider. "Let's see how long you can hold out." With a sharp command, his wolves surged forward. Alyssa stepped back onto the porch, heart hammering as Lachlan lunged at the first wave, teeth flashing. Corbin fired bolt after bolt, dropping wolves before they could reach the cabin, but there were too many. Alyssa squeezed the trigger, dropping a wolf just as it leapt for Lachlan's exposed flank. For a brief moment, their eyes met across the battlefield, and Alyssa felt the bond flare between them, strong and steady. They were in this together, and no matter how many wolves Cale brought, she wasn't backing down. Chapter 18. The Edge of the Clearing. Branches snapped underfoot as Alyssa pushed forward, following the trail of blood and disturbed snow. The trees pressed in around her, and the light from the cabin flickered faintly in the distance behind her. Cale wanted this. He wanted her alone. And yet, Alyssa didn't stop. The bond that tied her to Lachlan burned deep in her chest, pulsing like a second heartbeat. "Hold on, I'm coming." When Alyssa broke into the clearing, Cale was waiting. He stood casually near a fallen log, arms crossed over his broad chest, his dark coat dusted with snow. Behind him, Lachlan lay slumped on the ground, blood staining his side and the snow beneath him. Cale's betas circled like vultures, but none of them touched Lachlan now. They were waiting for orders. Alyssa's stomach twisted, but she didn't lower the rifle. "Let him go," she demanded, leveling the barrel at Cale. Cale smirked, his eyes gleaming in the moonlight. "Or what? You'll shoot me again?" We both know how well that worked last time. Alyssa's finger hovered over the trigger. "I won't miss." Cale took a step forward, completely unbothered by the weapon aimed at his chest. "You're brave, I'll give you that. But tell me, Alyssa, why fight this?" He gestured to Lachlan, unconscious form. "He's already broken. Give him to me and this ends tonight. No more running, no more fights." Elizabeth tightened her grip. "You know I'm not doing that." Cale tilted his head slightly, as if considering her. Why protect him? Has he really earned that loyalty? Her heart pounded painfully, but the bond thrummed stronger, grounding her. Loyalty isn't something you earn, she shot back. It's something you give to the people who matter. And Lachlan? Her voice sharpened. He matters. Cale's eyes narrowed, the playful smirk dropping from his face. So stubborn, he muttered. I wonder if you'll still feel that way when he's gone. Before Alyssa could react, Cale shifted, his monstrous wolf form erupted from his human shell, lunging toward her in a flash of silver fur and fangs. Alyssa's heart stopped, but she didn't run. Instead, she dropped the rifle and thrust her hands toward the snow-covered ground beneath her. The stone. She could feel it now, humming faintly. Waiting. The bond between her and Lachlan ignited, blazing hotter than it ever had before. Protect him. Cale's claws were inches from her when Alyssa's fingers brushed against the icy earth, tracing the symbols carved into the stone beneath the surface. The ground pulsed. A wave of searing light exploded outward, racing across the clearing and throwing Cale backward like a rag doll. He hit the ground hard, skidding through the snow as his massive form flickered and shrank. By the time he rolled to a stop, Kyle lay in human form, breathing heavily, his eyes wide with shock. Alyssa stood in the center of the clearing, chest heaving as the stone's energy faded beneath her touch. Lachlan groaned softly behind her, beginning to stir. Kyle's gaze flickered between them, his eyes narrowing. You think this is over? He hissed, dragging himself to his feet. Alyssa raised the rifle again, dragging his eyes with him. I think you should leave while you can still walk. For a long, tense moment, Cale didn't move. Then, without another word, he disappeared into the woods. Alyssa exhaled shakily, the bond between her and Lachlan still pulsing, stronger now than ever before. She dropped to her knees beside him, brushing his hair gently from his face. You held on, she whispered. Lachlan opened his eyes, blinking up at her. I knew you'd come. Alyssa smiled softly, helping him sit up. It's not over yet, she said, glancing toward the trees where Cale had vanished. But next time, we'll be ready. Ooh. Horton's voice came from the forest, with the cold air stung Alyssa's lungs as she knelt beside Lachlan, her heart still pounding from the burst of energy that had thrown Cale back. Lachlan's hand rested lightly on her knee, his breathing shallow but steady. Stay here, she whispered, brushing a lock of hair from his forehead. I'll handle him. Lachlan grunted, trying to rise. You shouldn't. Alyssa pressed him back down gently. I should. You said it yourself. This isn't something I can handle alone. But now, neither can you. He met her gaze, pain flickering behind his eyes, but he didn't argue. Alyssa rose to her feet, turning back toward the dark edge of the clearing. Snowflakes swirled in the air, drifting silently as Cale emerged from the tree line once more. His clothes were torn, blood trailing from his temple where he'd hit the ground. But the fire in his eyes hadn't dimmed. Alyssa's hands tightened around the rifle. You're persistent, she said, leveling it at him. Cale wiped the blood from his lip, his gaze hardening. And you're naive. You think a stone and a few parlor tricks can stop me? Alyssa held her ground. It stopped you once. Cale's eyes flicked to Lachlan, who lay defenseless a few feet behind her. His smirk returned. Funny, Cale drawled. You're standing between him and me, but the second you slip, he moved. Faster than she could react, Kale's hand shot out, gripping Alyssa by the throat and lifting her off the ground. The rifle slipped from her grasp, landing with a soft thud in the snow. Alyssa gasped, clawing at his hand as he held her effortlessly. "You're brave," Kale said, tilting his head. "But bravery doesn't win wars. Strength does. And right now?" He leaned closer, his voice a cold whisper. "You don't have any." Her vision blurred, but Alyssa could still hear Lachlan's faint growl behind her. He tried to rise again, but Kale murmured, "He's already dying, Alyssa. This is inevitable." Alyssa's eyes burned, but through the fog of panic, something clicked. Kale didn't kill Lachlan outright. Why? She remembered his wolves, how they hesitated when Lachlan fought back, how Kale's pack only moved when he gave the order. He's strong, Alyssa realized, but only as long as they follow him. Her gaze flickered toward Kale's side. The silver knife she'd tucked into her belt was still there, pressed against her waist. She stopped struggling. Kale's eyes narrowed. Giving up already, Alyssa's hand inched toward the hilt of the knife. "No," she rasped, meeting his gaze. "I'm just getting started." Before Kale could react, she yanked the knife free and drove it into his side. Kale's eyes widened in shock as the blade pierced him, glowing faintly with silver light. Alyssa twisted it, feeling the blade sink deeper. A howl of pain erupted from Kale, and Alyssa felt the ripple of energy pulse outward, like a thread snapping violently. Kale's grip faltered, and she dropped to the ground, coughing as air rushed back into her lungs. All around them, Kale's wolves staggered, their bodies trembling, as if the bond between them had been severed. Kale stumbled backward, pressing a hand to his bleeding side, his face contorted in rage and disbelief. "You," he growled, baring his teeth. "You broke it." Alyssa staggered to her feet, keeping the knife raised between them. "You said it yourself. Strength wins wars. But strength doesn't come from control. It comes from trust." Kale's eyes flicked to his scattered pack. Wolves who once obeyed his every command now stood uncertain, their gazes shifting between him and the blood dripping into the snow. For the first time, Kale's confidence wavered. "Leave," Elise said, stepping forward, "or I'll cut the rest of the ties holding you together." Kale's eyes burned with hatred, but he didn't move. Behind Alyssa, Lachlan forced himself onto one elbow, his voice low but steady. "You heard her, Kale." Kale glared at his brother, but he said nothing. Alyssa held his gaze, refusing to back down until Kale finally turned, melting into the shadows of the trees. His pack followed reluctantly, leaving the clearing eerily silent. Alyssa exhaled slowly, the knife trembling in her grip. Lachlan groaned behind her, and she rushed to his side, helping him sit up. "You're ridiculous," Lachlan muttered, his voice hoarse but laced with pride. "Thanks," Alyssa replied, brushing snow from his hair. "But we're not done yet." Lachlan nodded, his golden eyes still fixed on the tree line where Kale had disappeared. "No," he said softly, "but we will be." Chapter 19. Ash and Stone. The world spun as Alyssa hit the ground hard, snow flying up around her. Pain jolted through her body, but she barely had time to react before Kale's shadow loomed over her, his eyes burning like twin embers in the dark. He pressed a boot against her chest, pinning her to the frozen earth. "This ends now," Cale growled, his voice low and menacing. The silver knife Eliza had plunged into his side lay discarded in the snow, glinting faintly in the moonlight. Alyssa gasped for breath, gripping his ankle in a desperate attempt to shove him off, but his strength was unrelenting. "You've been a thorn in my side long enough," Cale snarled. "Your bond with Lachlan may have weakened me, but it won't save you." He raised his hand, claws lengthening as he prepared to strike. Alyssa's heart pounded, every nerve screaming at her to move, but she was trapped. Her vision blurred, and for a moment, it felt like the inevitable was crashing down on her. But then, "Good idea." Cale hesitated. His hand frozen mid-air. He couldn't move. The musicians lowered their instruments into the water, and Cale hesitated, his hand frozen mid-air. A low, dangerous growl echoed through the clearing. Alyssa twisted her head just in time to see Lachlan rise from the snow, blood dripping from his side, but fury blazing in his golden eyes. His wolf form towered in the moonlight, his teeth bared, his body trembling with the effort to stay standing. Alyssa's chest tightened, the bond between them flaring like fire in her veins. Cale scoffed. "You can barely stand." Lachlan's gaze didn't waver. "I can stand long enough to put you down." With a snarl, Lachlan lunged. Cale barely had time to react before Lachlan collided with him, knocking him off Alyssa and into the snow. Alyssa scrambled to her feet, lungs heaving as she reached for the knife. Her fingers closed around the hilt, and she turned just in time to see the two brothers clash. They rolled across the ground, teeth and claws flashing in the dark. Cale was stronger. Lachlan was relentless. But even Alicia could see the toll the fight had taken on Lachlan. His movements were slowing, his strength beginning to falter. Cale pinned Lachlan down, snarling inches from his throat. "Stay down," Lachlan growled, but his body trembled beneath Cale's weight. Alyssa's grip on the knife tightened. "This is our land." She could feel the stone beneath the snow, pulsing faintly, alive with the energy of the bond she and Lachlan had forged. The land was calling to her. And she answered. Alyssa sprinted forward, snow crunching beneath her boots. Cale twisted toward her just as she drove the silver knife into his chest, aiming for the center of the glowing bondstone beneath him. Cale's eyes widened in shock as the blade pierced him, the stone flaring to life beneath their feet. Light erupted from the ground, crackling and twisting like fire as it coiled around Cale's body. "No!" Cale gasped, but the light only grew brighter, pulling him downward, as if the earth itself refused to let him escape. Lachlan rolled to the side, breathing heavily as he watched Cale's form flicker, breaking apart into ash and shadow. Cale's eyes locked onto Alyssa's one last time, his voice barely above a whisper. "You think this will save him? You can't protect him forever." His body crumbled, the last of him dissolving into the snow, leaving nothing but scattered ash drifting on the wind. Alyssa stood over the stone, breathless and shaking. Lachlan shifted back to human form, staggering to his feet. Alyssa rushed to his side, steadying him as his arm wrapped around her shoulders. "It's over," she whispered, feeling the land beneath them settle. The bond hummed softly now, no longer burning, just steady and strong. Lachlan leaned into her, exhaustion in his voice. "Yeah, it is." From the tree line, Cale's remaining wolves watched in silence, their eyes wide and uncertain. Without their leader, they began to retreat, one by one fading into the forest until the clearing was still again. Lachlan exhaled deeply. They'll scatter now. Without Cale, there's nothing holding them together. Alyssa tightened her grip around his waist. Good. Let them run. As the snow settled around them, the bondstone beneath the surface pulsed softly, like a heartbeat beneath the earth. Alyssa could feel it. The land was safe. And as she glanced at Lachlan, she knew something else. So was he. The snow fell softly now, each flake drifting lazily to the ground, as if the world itself had exhaled. The clearing was silent, save for Alyssa's heavy breaths and the faint crackling of the bondstone beneath her feet. Lachlan swayed beside her, his arm draped heavily over her shoulders. Lachlan? Alyssa's voice wavered as she looked up at him. His eyes fluttered, but his body leaned into hers, weak and unsteady. I'm fine, Lachlan murmured, though his pale face said otherwise. Alyssa's grip tightened around his waist. You're a terrible liar. Before he could respond, his knees buckled, and he collapsed into the snow. Lachlan! Alyssa dropped to her knees beside him, shaking his shoulders. His breathing was shallow, his skin cold to the touch. Footsteps crunched behind her. Corbin appeared from the tree line, his crossbow hanging at his side. Amara followed, leading the remaining shifters. Corbin's sharp eyes swept the clearing, taking in the ash, the glowing stone, and Lachlan's motionless form. Well, he said dryly, kneeling beside them, I see things got lively while I was gone. Alyssa shot him a glare. Now's not the time, Corbin. He smirked faintly, but his expression softened as he examined Lachlan's wounds. He's breathing. That's a good start. Alyssa brushed damp hair from Lachlan's forehead, her thumb lingering on a smear of blood. The bond between them hummed faintly. Still there, still strong, but she could feel the exhaustion weighing him down. Amara crouched nearby, watching quietly. The pack's gone, she said, still looking at Andrew. Cale's wolves scattered the moment he fell. They won't be back anytime soon. Alyssa let out a slow breath. Good. As if responding to her relief, the hidden stone beneath them flickered one last time before its glow faded entirely. Alyssa felt it, like a shift in the air. The barrier protecting the land was whole again. It's over, Corbin said, glancing around. At least for now. Alyssa nodded, though the tightness in her chest refused to ease. For the first time since Cale's arrival, there was peace. But as Eliza looked down at Lachlan, his face pale, his body limp in the snow, she realized peace had come at a cost. The bite mark was lost in the gentle light shimmer. Later that night, the cabin was warm, the fire crackling softly in the hearth. Alyssa sat on the edge of the couch, pressing a damp cloth to Lachlan's forehead. He hadn't stirred since they brought him inside, but his breathing had grown stronger. Corbin sat at the kitchen table, sharpening a blade in silence, while Amara rested near the door, arms crossed as she watched the window for any sign of movement. It felt strange, the quiet after everything. Eliza dipped the cloth in warm water, wringing it out. Her hands trembled slightly, but she ignored it, focusing on the simple task in front of her. You're hovering, Corbin remarked without looking up. Eliza glared at him, and making sure he doesn't die. That's not hovering. Sure, Corbin said, smirking. Keep telling yourself that. Alyssa rolled her eyes, but before she could retort, a faint groan sounded from the couch. Her heart leapt. Lachlan's eyes flickered open, squinting against the light of the fire. His gaze settled on Alyssa, a weak smile tugging at his lips. Did we win? He rasped, his voice hoarse. Alyssa smirked, relief flooding her chest. Barely. Lachlan let out a soft chuckle, wincing as he tried to sit up. Alyssa pressed him back down gently. Don't even think about it, she warned. You're staying right there. Lachlan sighed, sinking back into the couch with a lopsided grin. You saved me, didn't you? Don't get used to it, she teased, though the weight behind her words made her voice tremble. His golden eyes softened, lingering on her for a moment longer. I knew you would. Alyssa looked away, busying herself with the cloth to hide the flush creeping into her cheeks. Corbin snorted from across the room. You two are nauseating. Alyssa shot him a glare. And yet you're still here. Someone's got to keep things interesting. Lachlan laughed quietly, though it quickly faded into a cough. Alyssa steadied him, brushing stray hair from his face. You scared me, she admitted softly, just loud enough for him to hear. Lachlan's hand found hers, his thumb brushing against her knuckles. I'm not going anywhere, he said. Cale's gone. We made it. Alyssa nodded, though the truth lingered unspoken between them. Cale might have been defeated, but the scars he left behind wouldn't fade overnight. Still, as she sat beside Lachlan, his hand warm in hers, the bond between them steady and unbroken, Alyssa realized something else. They had survived. And together, they could heal. Chapter 20. Rooted in the Wild. Snow crunched beneath Alyssa's boots as she stepped outside, gazing across the clearing that stretched endlessly beyond the cabin. The land was still, peaceful under a fresh layer of white, but signs of the recent battle lingered. Broken branches, claw marks etched into tree trunks, and faint scorch marks along the edges of the cabin's walls. Yet, the cabin still stood. It was battered but unyielding. A reflection, Alyssa thought, of herself. She adjusted her grip on the hammer as Lachlan emerged from the woods, hauling a bundle of logs over his shoulder. His hair was damp with sweat despite the cold, and faint scars traced his jawline. Remnants of their fight with Cale. I thought you were supposed to be taking it easy, she called out, leaning against the porch railing. Lachlan smirked as he dumped the firewood by the steps. I could say the same for you. Alyssa held up the hammer. Fixing the porch isn't as dangerous as hauling trees across the clearing. Lachlan stepped closer, brushing snow from her sleeve with a warm hand. You're not giving yourself enough credit. I saw how you handled Cale. A little woodwork should be easy after that. She smiled, but a flicker of disbelief still lingered in her chest. They had survived. There were moments when she thought they wouldn't. But here they were. Lachlan standing beside her, the bond between them steady and strong, as if it had always been there. And now, the wilderness no longer felt like something to escape. It felt like home. For the next week, they worked side by side, patching the cabin and reinforcing the outer walls. Corbin stuck around long enough to help with the repairs, grumbling the whole time, of course. You realize I could be lounging by a fire somewhere else, right? Corbin muttered as he hammered a wooden plank into place. Alyssa smirked from the roof, where she was fixing loose shingles. "You could leave any time, Corbin." He glanced up at her, raising an eyebrow. "And miss the grand reopening of Elise's Cabin of Doom? Not a chance." Lachlan chuckled from below, chopping firewood nearby. "Admit it, you'd miss us." Corbin groaned dramatically. "Fine, a little. But if this place falls apart again, you're on your own." Alyssa shook her head fondly. By the end of the week, Corbin packed up his things, giving Lachlan a firm handshake before heading toward the tree line. "You know where to find us," Lachlan said. Corbin glanced over his shoulder. "Let's hope I don't have to." Alyssa waved as Corbin disappeared into the woods, leaving her and Lachlan alone once more. The silence didn't feel empty. It felt right. That evening, Alyssa stood on the porch, wrapped in a thick blanket, as snowflakes danced through the air. Lachlan emerged from the cabin behind her, shifting effortlessly into his wolf form. He padded silently to her side, his fur brushing against her leg as he sat, golden eyes scanning the clearing. Alyssa glanced down at him, running her fingers gently through his thick coat. "You're keeping watch again?" she asked softly. Lachlan huffed, resting his head against her hip. "You know, I never thought I'd feel at home out here," she continued, gazing into the dark woods. "When I first built this cabin, I thought isolation was the answer. I thought if I kept the world at arm's length, I could avoid being hurt again." Lachlan shifted back into his human form, wrapping an arm around her waist as he leaned against the porch railing. "And now?" he asked, his voice low. Alyssa exhaled slowly, watching her breath curl in the cold air. "Now I'm not so afraid of the wild," she admitted. "It's not something to run from anymore." Lachlan pressed a soft kiss to her temple. "You're part of it now." Alyssa nodded, resting her head against his shoulder. The bond between them hummed faintly, as comforting as the warmth of the fire inside the cabin. For the first time in years, she wasn't just surviving. She was living. As they stood in the quiet of the clearing, Lachlan's gaze drifted toward the far side of the cabin. "You know," he began casually, "we could add another room." Alyssa arched an eyebrow. "Another room?" Lachlan smirked. "Sure, a little expansion, maybe for future company." Alyssa's cheeks warmed despite the cold. "Are you saying you're planning for company?" Lachlan's eyes twinkled mischievously. "Just thinking ahead." Alyssa laughed softly, tugging him back toward the warmth of the cabin. "Let's start with fixing the front door first," she teased. Lachlan followed, his hand lingering in hers as they crossed the threshold. As the door shut behind them, Alyssa realized something. The wilderness, once an untamed force she feared, was now the foundation of the life she was building. And with Lachlan by her side, she knew they'd face whatever came next. Together. The snow fell in a slow, peaceful rhythm, coating the forest in soft white. Each flake seemed to settle gently, as if nature itself was sighing in relief. The land was quiet, untouched, and whole again. Alyssa stood on the porch, wrapped in a heavy cloak, her arms crossed over her chest as she gazed out over the clearing. The soft hum of the bondstone beneath the earth pulsed faintly under her feet, a steady reminder of everything they had fought for. The air smelled of pine and frost, but there was something else lingering in the woods. It felt like home. Behind her, the faint creak of the cabin door opened, but she didn't turn around. She knew who it was by the warmth that pressed against her back and the gentle way he rested his chin on her shoulder. Lachlan's arms slid around her waist, pulling her closer as they watched the snow drift lazily down over the clearing. "You've been out here for a while," he murmured against her ear. His voice was soft, as steady as the heartbeat she felt against her back. "I know," Alyssa replied, leaning into him. "I just like watching it." Lachlan chuckled quietly. "You never used to. I remember when you hated the woods, said they were unpredictable." Alyssa smiled, tilting her head slightly to brush her cheek against his. "I still think they are, but maybe that's not such a bad thing anymore." Lachlan pressed a kiss to her temple, his breath warm against her skin. "It's funny," she said softly, watching the distant tree line where the forest stretched far beyond sight. "I used to think the wild was something I had to fight against. Now it feels like it's part of me." "It is part of you," Lachlan replied. "The land remembers those who protect it." Alyssa glanced up at him. "You're just full of wolf wisdom, aren't you?" He smirked. "I do my best." Lachlan's eyes flicked to the forest, glowing faintly in the dim light. Without a word, he stepped back, his body shifting effortlessly into his wolf form. His fur shimmered silver in the moonlight, and he padded silently down the porch steps. Alyssa leaned on the railing, watching as he moved through the snow, his massive form blending with the shadows of the trees. It still amazed her, how seamlessly he belonged to the wild. And now, she did too. Lachlan circled the clearing, his sharp eyes scanning the edges of the property. His presence was a comfort, not a guard dog, but a part of the land's natural rhythm. After a few moments, he returned to her side, settling at her feet with a soft huff. Alyssa knelt beside him, running her fingers through his thick fur. For the first time in as long as she could remember, she felt safe. She smiled to herself, pressing her forehead gently against Lachlan's. "We made it," she whispered. Lachlan shifted back, pulling her against him once more. "Yeah," he said softly. "We did." The forest stretched endlessly around them, untamed and unpredictable. But Alyssa no longer feared it, because she wasn't standing alone anymore. This was her place, her home, and with Lachlan by her side, the unknown wasn't something to hide from. It was something to welcome. As the snow continued to fall, Alyssa closed her eyes, listening to the quiet heartbeat of the forest, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it, together. Spring had come early to the forest, breathing warmth into the once snow-covered clearing. The trees stood tall and full, their leaves shimmering in the golden light that filtered through the branches. Flowers bloomed along the edges of the cabin, pushing their way through the soft earth. Alyssa knelt beside one of the garden beds, running her fingers through the soil as she planted the first seeds of the season. She paused, tilting her head to listen to the soft rustling of footsteps behind her. Lachlan. She didn't need to turn around to know it was him. The familiar warmth of his presence brushed against her through the bond they shared, as constant as the pulse beneath her skin. "You're quiet today," Alyssa said, glancing over her shoulder with a smirk. Though she leaned casually against the porch railing, watching her with a smirk that sent a pleasant shiver down her spine. "Just admiring the view," he replied, his golden eyes flicking over her. Alyssa rolled her eyes, but couldn't hide the blush creeping across her cheeks. "You've seen me planting 100 times. Never gets old," he said, stepping down into the garden. He knelt beside her, brushing dirt from her cheek with the pad of his thumb. Alyssa leaned into his touch, feeling the bond softly between them. It had grown stronger in the weeks since Kale's defeat, deeper, unbreakable. Her world had shifted, but instead of fear, Alyssa felt grounded, rooted. "You know," Lachlan said, tracing slow circles along the back of her hand, "I think this cabin feels smaller every day." Alyssa arched a brow. "Are you suggesting we expand?" He shrugged, though the mischievous glint in his eyes betrayed him. "Maybe. Or maybe I'm suggesting we break it in properly." Alyssa smirked, catching the teasing edge to his voice. "Oh, is that right?" Lachlan leaned closer, his breath warm against her neck. "I seem to remember a certain bond ritual we never quite finished the way we were supposed to." Elise's pulse quickened as she turned to face him, their noses nearly touching. The weight of his gaze, hungry and soft all at once, stole the air from her lungs. "You're lucky I like you," she whispered, brushing her lips against his. Lachlan's arms wrapped around her, pulling her fully into his lap. The bond between them faded, and for a brief moment the forest around them faded away. There was only him, his warmth, his strength, and the way his touch made her heart race. "More than like," Lachlan murmured against her lips. "You're mine, Alyssa, and I'm yours." Alyssa smiled, threading her fingers through his hair. "I know." As the sun dipped lower in the sky, the forest wrapped around them like a protective shield. The wilderness that once felt like an untamed force now felt like home, alive and full of promise. And as Lachlan kissed her beneath the canopy of leaves, Alyssa knew she had found exactly where she belonged.